So we left off yesterday with Virginia, and one of the things you may have learned in elementary school was that there are three sort of distinct colonial regions. And the original South is often called in notes and stuff like that, the Chesapeake colonies, because they initially originate around the Chesapeake Bay. Now, later Georgia, which we'll get to in a minute, was added in 1733, which is practically an entire different, well, it is an entirely different era. But nonetheless, the colonies that are the closest to Virginia in terms of economics and culture and society are Maryland and the Carolinas, although Maryland does start out distinctively different. So we want to look at Maryland now. Now, all of these colonies would have not only legalized slavery, which again is legalized everywhere, but are plantation-based economies. So that means the people who have money are large-scale landowners. And so Maryland was originally created for a debt that was owed to this man's family. This is George Calvert, and he was known in England as Lord Baltimore. So that should kind of give you a clue. Lord Baltimore, which is the answer you can write down. You don't have to answer Calvert if you're ever answering about this person. But Baltimore was owed some money by the Stuart monarchy, and so they gave him this tract of land in America, in North America, and what that meant was he owned, in essence, the colony. So we call that a proprietary colony, a colony that's run by an individual or a small group. Virginia by pretty soon it becomes a royal colony, but initially Maryland is a proprietary colony, which means run by proprietors. Maryland is St. Mary's is a better location, at least geographically and environmentally, than Jamestown. So Jamestown has a lot of sickness in the origination, a lot of unhealthy atmosphere. They even thought it was vapors coming up from the swamp, making them sick. But Maryland wasn't as bad. And again, they were tobacco farmers. That was the lifeblood of really the original Southern colonies. They were dominated by profitable crop development. And so, Calvert doesn't come to America. He doesn't intend to live here. He doesn't create a vast estate here personally. He wants it to be run, the way he feels and believes to benefit his friends and neighbors and family members over here in North America. And so, in essence, he'll be like an absentee feudal lord. He's like a baron back over in England. And so he gives a good chunk of his territory to his family members. Now, the thing that's a crucial moment that you need to pick up here is that Calvert was Catholic. And that is very unusual in England. In fact, you may recall that the Tudors had pretty much run the Catholics out until Elizabeth had kind of tolerated Catholics, okay? But James and Charles, particularly Charles, is sympathetic more towards his Catholic friends. And so he is less hateful to the Catholics. And so this is how Catholic people are sort of okay. I'm not going to say they're great, but they're treated with some toleration now over in England. But many of them don't feel comfortable there. And so they want to come to North America, to the English colony, as a religious refuge, a place where they can be Catholic and not persecuted. And so that's his intent. It's like, okay, we'll settle the Catholic people that are my friends and family and neighbors over here in Maryland, named after that Mary, not Queen Mary, but actually Mary, the mother of Christ, although that Queen Mary is named after her too. So here you see, here you see where Maryland was, okay? And obviously this is the modern state boundary of Maryland here. So this and this are really where, initially Maryland was settled, along this part, on the other side of the Potomac and Chesapeake from Virginia. And so this is the original colony. So when you think about Maryland, it was St. Mary's, and it's really down here at the tip of what is today modern Maryland. So if you've ever been up to D.C., which is up here at the headwaters of the Potomac, D.C. sits right, it's actually made up of territory from both Maryland and Virginia, mostly Virginia. And so you can come down to Baltimore on this side, okay? So this is where, like when you cross the river from D.C., there's Baltimore, the harbor. And we'll talk more about Baltimore when we get to the War of 1812. So again, a proprietary plantation colony. But the exception to it is that it's Catholic, at least initially. Now, the problem is that there were only so many Catholic leader types, and so eventually other people start coming, like indentured servants, and these people aren't Catholic. And so they start distributing around the hinterlands of Maryland. In other words, away from St. Mary's, in the more in the kind of countryside. If you've ever been out to Sharpsburg or parts in Western Maryland near the near the continent, not continental divide, but where the Appalachians are open, there's a trail that goes through there. They kind of settle in the frontier there, and that means very quickly the Catholic landowners were outnumbered by these Protestant sort of yeomanry, these Protestant working class farmer types. And as going to be the story of American history, there is going to be real animosity between worker bees and landowners. Like there's this really big issue, and this issue is exacerbated, worsened, because the landowners are Catholic. So in the future, you're actually going to have a rebellion, like armed uprising against these land barons. But initially, the Catholic leadership are concerned because they're getting voted out. In essence, they're democracy, so to speak, here, which is not really democracy, but it's sort of like the House of Burgesses. The farmers outnumber the Catholics. And, again, slavery does ultimately come into Maryland as it did into Virginia, sort of slowly initially. But, the problem was the Protestants outnumbered the Catholics. And so there was great concern that in the assembly in Maryland, they would actually vote out Catholic freedom. So the Catholic government, which was, kind of on the verge of becoming they were a minority, passed a law. And it's a very historic law because when we think about religious freedom in America, it kind of is an evolutionary process. It just doesn't appear overnight. It's just not born out of the Enlightenment. So in other words, there are Catholics in Maryland, and if you're not sure why Catholics would be persecuted or hated, you should know the conflict that is the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation in England really targeted Catholics for their historic, enemy, kind of thing. So this Act of Toleration was quite progressive for its day. It said you could be Catholic and legitimate. And again, this is going to be one of the causes of the revolution is the British allow French Catholics to live in the English territory. Like it's weird today to hear people be like vehemently anti-Catholic, but that was the case. So this Toleration Act or Act of Toleration, usually not necessary to put the date, although the date's useful. But when you're writing this as an answer, you don't have to put of 1649. It's the Act of Toleration kind of thing. But it guaranteed toleration of all Christians. Now, for my non-Christian students, this is not a progressive thing for your faith. I want to make sure you understand this. In other words, this was an act of toleration for Christians, not an act of toleration for all religions. And so if you did not believe in Jesus as divine, and that you didn't have to be a Christian to not believe that. There are a lot of people who don't believe that. And so if you doubted the divinity of Jesus, his Godhead, so to speak, like if you were Jewish or, of course, Muslim or atheist, they would kill you. So that's not progressive in today's terminology. Of course not. But not a lot of these folks would be in America yet anyway. Not that that's a good or bad thing, but it did progress in other words, it defined toleration for Christians. Now, if you consider that there was no law at all prior to this, then theoretically anyone could have been in Maryland religious-wise. So in some ways, it's less tolerant than nothing. But it was really designed to protect the Catholic people in Maryland. Like that was its objective. So I'm going to give you some of the actual transaction of the Act of Toleration. This is the language of it. And it's pretty interesting if you start reading what would happen to you if you were offensive to these folks. So here, it's not so much that you are not going to be able to like persecute these people, like, hang them on the civic square or something. But it says, if you, upon any occasion of offense in a reproachful manner, declare or call or denominate a person who lives, resides, goes through, that means traffic, trades or commerces in Maryland, harbors, creeks, or havens, here, they will give you a list of what you can't say. So you can't call somebody a heretic. You can't call somebody a schismatic, an idolater, a Puritan, an independent Presbyterian, the horror, an antinomian, a Barrowist, a Roundhead, a separatist, a popish priest, Jesuited papist, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, Brownist, or any other term that might be reproachful. So it made it a crime to call people these names. Like they listed names, so it's not really free there. But if you call somebody one of these things, for every time you do this, you will lose 10 shillings, which is a decent fine, like a substantive amount of money, or value on the goods. And here's an interesting entry, and chattels. So CHATTEL. First time I've used this word in this class, chattels. So a chattel is a slave. And this is the term that you should learn. Chattel means owned property. So, even as early as 1649 in Maryland, they're saying, if you can't pay 10 shillings, we're going to take that out of one of your slaves. Like, we're going to take a slave. Chattel, meaning human property. So you definitely want to learn that word, just because, well, it's where we're going to see a lot in this course, chattel slavery. But if you can't pay, you're going to be publicly whipped and imprisoned without bail until the person who was offended feels like they've been satisfied. So this is not what we would consider freedom of speech, But the idea is that we're going to keep this religious group from being persecuted, because already they're becoming a minority. And now later on, there's going to be a rebellion in Maryland, and this isn't going to work. People are going to attack Catholic people. But it does show you that they do come here for two reasons. One is for, of course, like what most people came to the Americas for, make money. Everybody wants to get rich. But the other reason is to be free to follow their faith, which is Catholicism. And when we get to the Pilgrims, we're going to talk again about people who migrate here for religious reasons and how that plays a part in our history. Now, the Carolinas are fascinating to me because they didn't start out as the Carolinas. They started out as Carolina, singular. So you should know that. Carolina was both North and South Carolina at the time. And it was named after King Charles II. The Latin word for Charles is Carolus, Carolus. And so Carolina is a version of that name. Charles II was a very popular monarch. These are sometimes known in American history as the Restoration colonies. If you know anything about Charles II, he was the Restoration King of England. And so initially, the Carolinas were like an overflow from the Caribbean. So if you think about like Bermuda or the Bahamas, which are not really Caribbean, but it's West Indies, Jamaica, Barbados, if you know Hamilton's background. St. Kitts and Nevis. So these were English colonies that were growing sugar a lot. But the problem was they weren't growing food. So if you went down to the Caribbean, all these great sugar islands, I know you think food is sugar, and of course it is, but that's not all you want to eat. So they needed food for their slaves, food for their plantations, and food for the people there. And so some enterprising Englishmen are like, well, just right up the road is the America, North English America, and we could settle there and grow the food and sell it down to the Caribbean. And so that's what they do. These are folks that have moved over from the Caribbean. They were not going to be successful sugar people, and they start growing on the coast. If you've ever been down to Myrtle Beach, if you've ever been down to Hilton Head, that far out. This is the rice empire of the Carolinas. They grow rice. And again, a lot of Americans don't think about colonial America as rice growers. But they import long staple rice from Africa. And the Africans were actually historically skilled at growing rice. Rice grows well in humid tropical and subtropical climates. And Africans had already been growing rice. So with that, and keep in mind, the English were using slaves in the Caribbean. And this is where they had started slavery officially. In other words, initially the English were behind the Spanish. They didn't use Africans as slaves. But on the island of Barbados, which is almost entirely sugar, it's like one vast sugar plantation. If you ever go down there, it's still like that much to this day. This is where slavery had been created by the English. And they modeled it after the Spanish to some degree. And that's where they began to define it as what we call chattel, meaning property. Very, very restrictive. African slaves would have no rights under these English tradition. They would not be treated as English people. They would not have the English Bill of Rights applied to them. And one of the horrible things about slavery under the development in England and in the English colonies is that the children of these slaves would also be enslaved, which makes this somewhat unique in Western history. Normally, slaves were prisoners of war. or purchased for very specific duties like domestic work, like cleaning houses or cooking. These would be field slaves as well as those others, and their offspring, their children, would also be slaves, which is just a horrendous element of American slavery. So these Barbados slave codes existed, and they were brought up to what becomes South Carolina. So when we think about really the birth of like the worst elements of slavery in America, South Carolina is where it originates. And of course, South Carolina is going to be really a thorn in our side as a nation, so to speak, because it's going to be they who lead secession and states' rights and arguments over the rights to own people. And so South Carolina is where we're looking at here. Again, named after King Charles, it is a proprietary colony, meaning it's actually a giant land grant to 8 individuals. Interestingly enough, the secretary for this group is the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. John Locke's day job is like laying out the plantations for the Carolinas, like taking censuses and doing the land division and making sure that the estate laws are in. So nonetheless, this was a proprietary colony with the intent of growing really valuable stuff, wine, vineyards, silkworms, olives. Well, most of that just doesn't pan out. Like that just doesn't work. But food becomes a major export. So if you're looking at both Carolinas, and the first major place in the Carolinas is Charlestown, which today is Charleston, obviously. So this part of the Carolinas at the time was not settled hardly at all. Like nobody hardly lived here. So it was really South Carolina that was what emerged. Okay. And they, their primary goal is to grow rice for the West Indies. Now, initially, they didn't use Africans initially. I want to make sure you understand this. They used Native Americans who the Savannah Indians helped them capture. So if you read apologists for like the Native American history, the folks like when you guys watched PragerU, these are the guys that are going to say, hey, man, Indians captured Indians or Africans captured Africans. And of course, that's true. I mean, that definitely did happen. The problem was if you're trying to survive, this is like, my point I often make as a comparable point is that, well, Jews helped do the Holocaust so they wouldn't get killed. Like this was survivalism for them. Like if the Savannah had one choice, either run away or cooperate with the Carolina settlers. And so they did. They enslaved the natives. Some went to New England, interestingly enough. Most went to the Caribbean. And then later on, the Savannah were run out. So thank you very much. So they ran them out to Pennsylvania, where they were treated well by William Penn and his team, so to speak. So even the Native Americans in the Carolinas didn't have a very good history, and some in the western part of the Carolinas, we're going to get to their history later, like the Cherokee. But in the eastern coastal Indians, both North and South Carolina, are going to be run off, either killed through raids or thinned to the point where they have to go join with other tribes to survive, like the Catawba. So lots of these conflicts with the coastal Indians are going to, but again, Native Americans don't make very good slaves historically. Tragically, they died. And so this is where they're going to start to really import Africans. This is Charlestown, again, named for King Charles, the merry monarch. It was the largest port in the southern half of the United States. Only going to be outpaced by New York City and Philadelphia initially, and then Boston. So there were basically 4 major cities in the colonies, and the largest by far in the South was this one. So Charlestown, South Carolina, Charleston was the sort of major southern city, one of the few, and it was comparable to New York and Philadelphia and Boston, kind of like big port cities. The folks who settled in Charlestown were very, very rich, like the folks who could stay in Charlestown. So if you've ever been down on the waterfront in Charleston at those beautiful houses or in the county around it, these would be sort of like the equivalent of the Virginia Cavaliers. They typically were very loyal to the British government, the British monarch. They were part of that proprietorship. And so the South Carolinians were often seen as the most snobby, the most elite, as well as the Virginians. And so this is where North Carolina gets the nickname a vale of humility between 2 mountains of conceit, because these rich people aren't settling in North Carolina, they're settling in South Carolina, and in the coast of Virginia. And honestly, as a port city, they were very diverse. And so you could see people from all over the world in Charlestown. So they were a little more business oriented and a little less religion concerned. They were Anglican, if you know that term. They were members of the Church of England, but they really didn't care this much about having religious beliefs as a major goal. I mean, they were churchgoers. I don't imply that they never went to church. They did, but it's kind of like some people go to church because that's what you're supposed to do, and it's like part of the community and society. They're these guys. Okay. And what did they grow? Most of all, rice. So, when I say rice, rice growing is not something we usually think about as a colonial export, but this was the lifeblood. So long before there was Myrtle Beach and Hilton Head, which of course today a lot of those communities is tourism, there was rice plantations. And so a lot of the islands, not the Outer Banks, not North Carolina's islands, these are way too not conducive for planting like crops. They're just good for wild horses and storms, but down in South Carolina, particularly, rice was really well established after they brought it from Africa. The problem, of course, is, like I said, Africans had experience doing this, so they made for very valuable slaves. South Carolina will be the largest slave colony percentage-wise. To this day, the United States, South Carolina is the majority African-American state. So, in other words, that state's population still to this day is a majority African-American. So from almost day one, blacks will outnumber whites in South Carolina. And that's one of the reasons why whites were so afraid of ending slavery or doing anything with slavery, because, well, Africans were very prevalent there, African-Americans now. So one of the things that's interesting, and again, this is something that's been researched, it's not me making this up. Africans, because of their population density and coastal location, had over the course of history developed an immunization trait towards malaria, meaning they'd been around it so much they began to pass down genetic resistance to it. If you know anything about African Americans, you may know, for example, that there is a proclivity to what is called sickle cell anemia, that more so than with, say, white people. And it is this genetic difference that creates this anomaly, so to speak, where sickle cell is more common, but resistance to malaria is higher. So just because of environment, which meant they did not die the way natives did. They did not die in the massive numbers. And unfortunately, later in history, people are going to argue, well, this is, a genetic reason for them to be slaves. Of course not. It just so happened that this is something they had history doing. English people couldn't grow rice, and so in England. And so this ended up being very successful. Excuse me. So as I mentioned, black slaves would be the majority of South Carolina, not North Carolina, but South Carolina. And to this day, African Americans still are. The state of South Carolina has the nation's only African American male senator right now in the U.S. Congress. So, still a very strong African American political presence, but not the case. You got to think of it almost as like apartheid South Africa here. In South Carolina, the minority were white people, and thus they had this genuine fear of slave rebellion, and there were many of those, down in that part of the country. So major state for this and for rice growing. Now, also successful in the upcountry, some like beyond the coast, is another product, and this was grown in several colonies, called indigo. Now, indigo is a dye. Today, we still use indigo to some degree, but most of our clothing that uses the color blue is synthetic, synthetic chemical dyes. But indigo is a naturally occurring plant that can be harvested and used to color fabric. And blues and purples were, kind of exotic. And so that was another profitable crop. What I guess I'm pointing out here is not so much that I care that you know indigo per se, although you should, but that the crop that you're going to associate with South Carolina later in history, and the crop that you associate with Mississippi and Alabama and Western Georgia, is going to be cotton. But in the 1600s, it is not a major industry. So please know that. Cotton, not colonial. Cotton is not really economically viable until after 1793 with the development of the cotton gin and its patent by Eli Whitney. So pre-1790s South is not a cotton kingdom. It's primarily tobacco in the upper colonies like Virginia, Maryland, the upper North Carolina, and cotton is not deep South, it's rice. So, When we get to Georgia, for example, rice growing and some burley tobacco grown down there, not cotton. Okay, so as you see here, particularly rice, it soars in production and soars in amount of exports. So colonial exports for the Deep South, primarily rice, lesser degree indigo. Oops, excuse me, other way. Now, the problem in South Carolina is they kept getting raided by Spaniards. The Spanish in Florida would, sneak up and attack Charleston, or capture slaves and release them, or depending on what they want to do with them. And runaway slaves would flee from South Carolina to Florida, where they would mingle with the Native Americans. That's where that Seminole term comes from. If you remember, I was talking about the Seminoles were a mixed ethnic group. So you have some conflicts where the Spanish fight the English in the Carolinas. And this is ugly. It's kind of the typical backcountry warfare. And so they would often, the Spanish, pay the Native Americans or urge them to fight the English too. So as you can see in South Carolina, there's some real conflict with Spanish Florida. Okay. But they weren't dying off. In other words, Carolina continued to resist. But by 1700, Carolina had become wealthy enough that they're like, we got to fix this. Okay. Now, before I get into how they fix it, I do want to look at North Carolina. So let's get ready to go to North Carolina. Okay. So as I mentioned before, now here in Danville, we have a really interesting story about the guy that actually divided the line between Virginia and North Carolina. His name is William Byrd of Westover, and he owned an enormous plantation down the road. He and his family. But if you come to Pittsylvania County, where we're located, right here on the border, he's the guy who, as a surveyor, went out and surveyed the dividing line. A religious guy, he's the guy who used the name Eden for the community on the other side of the Dan River. So if you're familiar with Eden, North Carolina, William Byrd named it. He named the streams around here. He named the creeks, and a lot of times. And his guide is a guy named Bearskin. And some of our students at Tunstall live in the Bearskin community, of Pittsylvania County. So, when you think about the dividing line, that was actually done by an Englishman here in Virginia. And so they officially divided it. But Virginia, like South Carolina, was very aristocratic, at least the people in charge, meaning Cavaliers and Charlestonians, and these were rich people, aristocratic people. And for the people who were not Anglican, let's say maybe you were Presbyterian, or later on you're going to have the Methodist movement emerge in the 1730s. Or let's say you couldn't get land, which was probably the bigger reason. Or you're my ancestors on my father's mother's side, which grew up in Beaufort, North Carolina. They were the first lighthouse keepers of Beaufort, that town. And so they couldn't really own much land, but they could claim that territory and build a lighthouse. But nobody really claimed North Carolina. They were we would call them squatters, meaning the King of England did not grant them the land. They didn't buy it from anybody. They just went and settled on it, and so nobody else was there. Now, a lot of these guys that settled in eastern North Carolina cut down trees for a living, particularly pine trees. And they cut down so much pine trees, they were infamous for walking around with, sticky sap stuck to their feet. And then over time, that sap, otherwise seen as tar, these Carolinians became known as tar heels, these pine tree chopping down forester types, So initially these were the more rough and tumble backcountry foresters, and fishermen and pirates. If you know anything about the Outer Banks and Cape Hatteras, Cape Lookout, these are the home of what's called the graveyard of the Atlantic. This is where Blackbeard the pirate hung out. So really an interesting colony, because they didn't really have much slavery. Ultimately, they will later. These weren't particularly Anglican. They were poor Southern white people, poor English white people. And so they migrated into this part of the Carolina. Remember the Vale of humility, kind of ordinary people in a valley between two mountains of conceited people, and so they were really not, they were by far, I think, other than the colony of Rhode Island, the freest people in America, meaning they weren't bound to any sort of hierarchy. They weren't particularly loyal to the crown. They weren't particularly loyal to any church. They were hospitable to, I mean, they let pirates hide out and not turn them over. So they were just kind of rough and tumble people. So I've always been fascinated by our North Carolina neighbors down here to the south. And again, a lot of my ancestry is from that part of the colonies. Really didn't like, like anyone telling them what to do at all. So these two colonies, North Carolina and Rhode Island, will be fiercely independent, just not letting anybody tell them how to conduct business. So in 1712, the crown approves a new colony being formed. So if you take a look at that date, that's over 100 years after Jamestown. Okay, so this is kind of a 100-year evolution. They had initially been just sort of the no man's land of Virginia and Carolinas, but ultimately they become an independent colony, a separate colony, and they will be a royal colony. They'll have a governor who they don't ever listen to and stuff like that. Unfortunately, they were not very nice to the natives. Big shock. You're going to have a hard time outside of Pennsylvania finding many English Americans being decent, so to speak, to Native Americans. They're going to go to war on the Tuscarora. Now, the Tuscarora are going to flee, and they're going to become the sixth tribe of the Iroquois Confederacy. They're going to move up to Western New York, where they are treated like New Yorkers don't go that far west initially. So the Tuscarora. Now, people look around here at our golf course and say, well, why is it named after Tuscarora? Honestly, I don't know. The best answer I can give you is that, first of all, if you're ever driving down Highway 29, you might see it called the Seminole Trail. That's complete BS. The Seminole Trail, the Seminoles never went down 29 in Virginia, certainly. Actually, some Florida tourist congressman wanted that to make people want to go to Florida. But we do think it's probable that the Tuscarora went through here on their way north. And so that would be the likely origin. I never asked anybody at the golf club, where'd you get the name from? But that's probable where Tuscarora is in this community on their way out. They're moving northward. And then the other tribe was the Yamasee. And the Yamasee were killed off, sadly, in the last Native American War. So by 1715, in the east, the eastern coast, pretty much all the Carolinian natives had either relocated, killed, or were left on what we call the frontier. Which, if you ever hiked the Appalachian Trail, South Carolina, North Carolina, very mountainous. If you've ever been to Boone or Asheville, really mountainous, and that's where the Native Americans still were after that. Okay. So the last colony in the South, and I do mean the last colony because this is the last colony established, not just in the South, but in America, initial of the 13, is Georgia. And there's a clue about the age of Georgia because it's named after King George, who's the first Hanover, actually named after George, the second. Anyway, it's named after the King Georges with 3 in a row there in the mid to late 1700s. We fought a revolution against George III. So here's Georgia. And right away, you can probably understand why Georgia was created, even if you haven't done the reading. If you think about, here's Spanish Florida, and they're just coming up, and here's Charleston. So they've been raiding up the coast here, raiding. Well, what's the best thing to do? Let's put someone else between them. So they'll stop raiding us, and they can raid them. And that's what's happened. So Georgia is established as a buffer colony. Okay. Now, its proprietor is a fellow named James Oglethorpe. He is what we would call a benevolent person, a do-good kind of person. He's trying to, be like a guy who does something honorable. And Oglethorpe, who was a part of the Methodist community that was emerging, said, I can run some of that land. And so the land was a buffer, if that makes sense. It's a buffer. So now Charleston will not be attacked anymore in Charleston, but the fighting will be in this buffer colony, in this Georgia territory. My ancestor, with the last name Touart, migrated right here and came and settled in what's called Escambia County, which is right here, West Florida, Pensacola. So this was Spanish territory, okay? And here was the buffer. And so the Spanish were, raiding here. And so, but Oglethorpe also wanted to, not only create this defensive sort of location, but to make some money, but also to help people. So Georgia was, England had a very, I think, ridiculous law, and it's very problematic because it's called debtor's prison. So the way debtor's prison works, if you don't pay someone your debt, then you get arrested and locked up until you pay off your debt. Well, you can't really pay off your debt from prison. So someone has to pay your debt for you. Well, a lot of people, they didn't. So these people are just like rotting away in debtor's prison. And so now you had an option. Now keep in mind, this is before Australia. Later on, Australia will be established basically for the same purpose, for prisoners to go to we don't want you living here and we don't want to pay for you. So we'll just send you to a prison island. But Georgia also had that purpose. Oglethorpe was like a philanthropist, a decent guy, trying to be anyway. And so they bring these debtors over here and they end up becoming farmers. And again, once people see that you can make money in Georgia, they move down to Savannah to become the major port city below Charleston. And he was opposed to slavery, but he gets outnumbered pretty quickly. And within 17 years of the colony's founding, slavery was brought in. So by now, all these southern colonies have slavery because they're cash crops and they're having a hard time getting white people to do the work by 1700. So they bring in these Africans, and it really does become a systematic method of holding people for life, tragically. And Oglethorpe, will pass into obscurity after this. Here's Savannah. Savannah was very diverse, like Charleston, also a fairly religiously tolerant society. Eventually, the Methodist faith will start in America in Savannah. John Wesley was an Englishman, and he starts the Methodist denomination of Protestantism, an emotional, sort of direct relationship with God as opposed to sort of the Anglican or Catholic approach. And so he becomes a missionary here to the Indians, to the debtors, to the slaves, and he will preach against the slavery and stuff like that. And then he migrates northward and spreads Methodism with him. So, interestingly enough, if you know that denomination, that's where it starts down in. Well, actually, it starts in England and comes over to Georgia, and he moves northward. And so this will be our last slide. And this is sort of one of those catch-all slides. I'm going to tell you everything that was sort of common between these cash crop economies, these southern plantation economies. So they were all cash crops, which means if you're not aware of that, that means you grow stuff with the intent of selling it, not necessarily the intent of you consuming it. That would be subsistence. So plantation economies with small-scale farming like around it, but really the big planters are where the bulk of it was. Because they're big planters, they model themselves on sort of like the lords of England, the barons, the dukes. They're not lords officially; they're not dukes or barons, but they emulate, they copy their style. All four of the southern colonies, five of the southern colonies. If you think about it, Maryland is confusing for students because it is a southern colony. Everybody established that. Maryland's a southern colony, but Maryland does not fight on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So some people think of it as not southern, but it's southern and part of one of these common groups. Very, very low population density. This is important because factories aren't going to develop in the South, for a very, very long time. One of the reasons is there are very few cities, and the cities that do exist are dominated by commercial people who use ports and merchants. Well, it's also meant that churches were much more scattered about. Many, many less churches than in, say, New England or the middle colonies. Many of the plantation owners would, in essence, serve as the minister on their own plantation. They preach to their family, their large extended family, and to their slaves. Some degree of religious toleration, but in every colony, all five colonies, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was the established church. So if you don't know what established means, you had to pay taxes for it. That church actually had taxpayer support. And then the word expansionary means the people who settled there continuously moved westward, west, because they would devour the soil and not implement crop rotation or other smart forms of agriculture. And that would mean they couldn't reuse it for years, but they owned so much they'd come back to it years later, kind of stuff. So this becomes known as land butchery. And so I think that'll wrap up the South. We'll stop now with the presentation.